Tonight we are looking at the book of Judges. It has to be one of my favorite Old Testament books. So many good lessons to derive from this book. I think this is probably a favorite of most of us. If not, if you don't know much about this book, if you're new in the faith and you haven't studied, this isn't a book that you know much about, then you're in for a treat, I think. Lots of good lessons to learn from this. The title, the book of Judges, it gets its name from, with regard to the different judges, the characters in the book that are called judges. Of course, a better term for judges, a better, more modern vernacular word for that really describes the position that they occupied a little bit better than judges, would be deliverers. These people were deliverers of Israel as Israel went through this very difficult time period. This book covers a period of about 300 plus years in which the remnant of the Canaanite nations that the Israelites were told to drive out with no uncertain terms. They were to eradicate them. They were to put them all to the sword. If not, they were to completely drive them out of the land. God was not playing about this, and He had His reasons, which we discussed last week, but they failed to do that. They failed to completely eliminate them. They compromised. They found other uses for the people. And as you go through chapter 1, you can, in this summary that we'll talk about in a few minutes, as you go through that chapter 1, there's kind of a recap of some of the things that happened at the end through the book of Judges, and a recap of the status of each one of those tribes and where they were in relation to that command to drive all the inhabitants out of the land. And you find that every one of them failed in some degree. Some of them some of them drove most of them out, but some of them they made slaves, or some of them they decided to allow them to live there as friends and neighbors, or some of them they allowed them to stay so that they could pay taxes to them and help the economy, or whatever. They come up with these reasons to not do what God was very plain in telling them that He wanted them to do. And that came back to bite them big time. Of course, God said that it would. God told them, in those blessings and cursings, and the cursings portion, God told them all the things that were going to happen to them if they did not obey His word. And so you can't say that they should not have known better. This chaotic period is often referred to, and fittingly referred to, as the Dark Ages of Israel, and they were dark times. The most notable characteristic of this book, at least in my mind, is the cycle of apostasy that is repeated over and over throughout the book, over a half a dozen times within the 3-century time period. Over half a dozen times you see this cycle of apostasy. And what is that cycle? Well, the people, after a while, after Joshua, the generation of Joshua's generation, after they've gone, after they've all passed on, these people go into idolatry. And so the cycle of apostasy begins with sin. And then, because of their sin, of course, God's promises were conditional. And because of their sin, then God allows their oppressors to come in. These inhabitants of the land, well, they go regroup. And they multiply, and they come back, and now they're angry. Now they're very upset over what Israel's done to them, and so now they come back with a vengeance. And God allows these nations to oppress His people, to try to get His people's attention. And so that's stage 2 in the cycle of apostasy. You got sin, and then you've got oppression, and then it gets so bad that the people finally start crying out to God, please save us, repentance. And then the next step is deliverance. God hears their cries, He sees their repentance, and so He raises up a deliverer, or a judge, to use the term in the book. He raises up a deliverer who will help them to beat down these oppressors so that they can have peace, which is the next step in the cycle of apostasy. And it would be nice if it stopped there, but it doesn't, because when they have peace for a while, over a short amount of time, they go right back to their idolatry, and the cycle starts over again. And it goes over and over, like I said, over half a dozen times in this book. Perhaps even more, but others are not recorded. This cycle is set forth in chapter 2. I want us to read the passage that kind of, if you read and listen to the words closely, he may not use the very words that I used, but you can, as you read this passage, you will see the cycle of apostasy in it. If someone would read chapter 2, verses 10 through 19, and pay close attention, everyone, and look for sin, oppression, repentance, deliverance, peace, and then back to sin. Just watch this as it unfolds. Who will read that for me? Barbara? Chapter 2, verses 10 through 19. All right, so hopefully you can, I think you can probably see the cycle of apostasy. See some of those key words popped out, other ones in not so many words, but it's clearly there. I know those at home that may be watching via live stream, I hope you'll just have to follow along on the readings. I like to let the class read some, but when we get to questions and answers, I will do my best to repeat those questions so the viewers at home might be able to follow along on the discussion. And so I want to kind of change to somewhat of a little bit of a different topic related to the book. Now, this is something that I've noticed throughout reading the book and reading different commentaries and different sources that others have written about this, that how many judges there were is a matter that is not so much a matter of importance. I'm not really sure that we even have all of the judges that lived throughout that period of time. It may be possible that some of the judges that lived during that time weren't even mentioned in Scripture. We don't know, but I will tell you this, the lists of judges vary greatly from one source to another. And I'm going to give you some examples of why that is. I have seen lists with as few as 12 and seen lists as high as 17. And so let me kind of explain why we might be getting different numbers. And since there is such a wide degree of wide survey, since there is such a wide opinion of how many judges there were, I don't think it's probably that important of a matter to us. But some lists contain both Deborah and Barak, for example, while other lists only have Deborah. Of course, the Bible says specifically that Deborah was a judge. Chapter 4, verse 4. It does not say that Barak was a judge, although he was a well-respected hero of the faith among the Jews. He's even mentioned in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 32 as one of the heroes of the faith, but the Bible doesn't call him a judge, so there's a little bit of an uncertainty there. And so some lists include him, some lists do not. Some lists do not include Eli and Samuel, who were clearly judges. But the reason they're not included in some lists is because they don't appear in the book of Judges. We don't read about them until the book of 1 Samuel. But they are identified in the book of 2 Samuel as being judges. For example, 1 Samuel 4:18, speaking of Eli, says, "And he judged Israel 40 years." Clearly, Eli was a judge. And 1 Samuel 7:15, "And Samuel judged Israel all the days of his life." Samuel was the last, as Paul stated, and after that he gave unto them judges about the space of 450 years until Samuel the prophet, which is important since now Paul, by inspiration, Paul has said that's the last judge, okay? But here's something kind of interesting. In the book of 1 Samuel, it lists two more after that. And 1 Samuel chapter 8, verse 1 and 2, "And it came to pass when Samuel was old that he made his sons judges over Israel. Now the name of his firstborn son was Joel, and the name of the second Abiah," or other spellings Abijah. "They were judges in Beersheba." And so, what's the answer to that? Well, maybe what is being pointed out by Paul there is that God did not appoint them judges. Samuel appointed them judges according to the text, but did God appoint them judges? And so that's just a matter to think about, and it explains why some lists of judges differ from others. And then the one that I usually think of first, some lists include this man named Abimelech, and I hate seeing Abimelech's name in the list of judges. Abimelech was a wicked man. He was not appointed by God as a judge. He appointed himself by force, and by the help of a gang of thugs, he murdered all but one of his 70 half-brothers. He was not a priest. He was not a prophet. And he did not deliver God's people from oppression. In fact, he brought them oppression. And so I hate to find his name on a list, but some people, he's added to a lot of lists because there's a couple chapters in the book of Judges that narrate through parts of his life. But that doesn't mean that he's a judge. His actions were clearly against the will of God, and he suffered a curse placed on him by one brother who got away. His inclusion in the narrative of the Judges, in addition to being the fact that he was a descendant of Gideon, and I think that's, if you follow the narrative of the book, the reason he seems to be introduced is because just at the end of Gideon's life, it says Gideon passed away and he had 70 sons, and then he also had a son by a concubine. And the son by the concubine was Abimelech. And then Abimelech had all of his half-brothers except the one that got away. He had them all murdered. And so we're just continuing talking about the descendants of Gideon. There's no indication whatsoever that Abimelech was meant to be a judge. Now, although I think we all can admit that just because somebody was a judge didn't mean they were perfect. Case in point, Sampson, right? Sampson had a lot of character flaws. I'm not suggesting to you that to be a judge you had to be some high moral standard. Not all of them were. But still, if the Bible doesn't say that they're a judge, I'm opposed to calling a person a judge just because their name appears in the book, especially this guy. But nevertheless, any questions about that before we move on? Okay, so you're going to find all kinds of different numbers on the list, and I even learned a neat little song to memorize the names of all the judges, and it's really helpful. If I thought I was a good singer, I would go ahead and sing it for you tonight, but maybe I'll sing it for you after services. But it helps me remember all the names of the judges, but Abimelech's name is in there, and so it kind of lets me down. I've even altered the song to take his name out. Let's talk about the penman and the audience. The author of the book does not identify himself. The most popular and reasonable suggestion that has been handed down through time is that the last of the judges, Samuel, is the one who wrote the book. And Samuel certainly lived in a time period where it seems like he would be a good answer to that. But other suggestions that have been offered is perhaps Phineas or Hezekiah or Ezra could have done it, but none of them really seem to fit the time period. Phineas would have had to been 300 years old by this time if he would have wrote it, and that's not, people at this point in time are not living to be 300 years old. And then Hezekiah would be 400 years later. Ezra would be 700 years later, so they don't really seem to be good suggestions. There's a reoccurring phrase in the book that not only gives insight into what brought about such times, but also as to the time in which it was written. And that is chapter 17, verse 6. It says, "And in those days there was no king in Israel, but every man did that which was right in his own eyes." That's an important verse because of the statement about every man doing that which is right in his own eyes. But here, in regard to the date, it's also important because it says, in those days there was no king in Israel, suggesting that perhaps the reader would have noticed that there was some type of a difference there. It suggests that maybe the reader would be familiar with a king in Israel. But in those days, there was no king in Israel. Well, if Samuel wrote it, then the date of the book would have been sometime in the middle 11th century BC, given Samuel's being contemporaneous with Eli, Saul, and David. Moreover, it would have likely been written from Shiloh. I'm reading from Dan Cates. Dan Cates wrote on this book in the Gospel Journal, and he said this. He said, if Samuel wrote it, then the date would be sometime in the early middle 11th century BC, given Samuel's being contemporaneous with Eli, Saul, and David. Moreover, it would have likely been written from Shiloh, which was a city of great importance in the latter period of the Judges and the early period of the Kings, 1 Samuel 4:3. Yes, sir?
Is there any significance that what you just mentioned in verse 6 of chapter 17, it's also listed on the board up there, Judges 21 and 25, that it said this twice.
Right.
About they had no king.
Let me look at verse 21, 25. I know verse 21, 25 mentions every man did that which is right in his own eyes, but I don't know if it repeats the first phrase.
It's almost word for word.
Is it? Okay. Let me look at verse 21, 25, and I did notice the fact that it was mentioned twice, and I'll tell you my thoughts on that, but in those days there was no king. Okay. I didn't remember offhand whether the first part of it was the same, but I did remember that it mentions that every man did that which was right in his own eyes. And I think that's significant because twice in the book, earlier in the book, and then at the end of the book, that phrase is mentioned, and it's almost like there's a lot of attention being drawn to that fact that this is a lot of terrible, terrible things happen in this book. And it almost seems to be answering the question, why did all these terrible things befall the children of God? Because every man did that which was right in his own eyes. That's the way I read that. It's almost like bookends, on this. Right. And so, especially in the last few chapters, some very terrible, terrible things. And the last several chapters of the book really kind of give a few examples of just how far they had fallen. And then it ends with that statement, and every man did that which is right in his own eyes. So it seems to be fitting, in my opinion, that it would be said again there. The purpose of this book is, the primary purpose at least, is to continue the historical narrative of the people of Israel. This again is one of those books of history. Now let's move on to the summary. In its main divisions, Israel's failure in chapter 1 through chapter 2, verse 5, is Israel's failure to complete the conquest of Canaan. We're reminded, we're kind of given a recap of some of where they were at the start of this book, and we're reminded that they failed. And that's what's brought all this to come to pass, or that was the seeds were sown by their failure and their fear. The seeds were sown to bring all these things to pass. In chapter 2, verses 6 through 16:31, that's a big section, okay? Chapter 2, verse 6, all the way through the end of chapter 16 is the cycle of apostasy happening over and over again. Now, we could divide that big section right there up a couple different ways. We could divide it up into 12 different character narratives, or we could divide it up into 7 oppressions. I'm just going to tell you what those are, and it's just a matter of preference. However you want to divide it up, whichever helps you as you're studying it, you might want to divide it up by characters. Then you would study about Othniel, then Ehud, Shamgar, Deborah, Gideon, and his family, which would include Abimelech and Jotham, and then Tola, Jair, Jephthah, Ibzan, Elon, Abdon, and then finally Sampson. Or if you divided it up according to the 7 oppressions, you would have the Mesopotamian oppression, the Moabite oppression, the early Philistine oppression, the Canaanite oppression, the Midianite oppression, the Ammonite oppression, and then the latter Philistine oppression. Again, however you divide that up is just a matter of preference. Then finally, the final chapter, 17 through 21, we see the extent of Israel's depravity, which broken up, chapter 17 and 18, we learn about this man Micah and his idolatry, and then we read about the Danites who stole Micah's idols and what they did with them, and then we'll talk about that a little more in a few minutes. And then the civil war in chapters 19 through 21, there was a civil war where Israel fought against the tribe of Benjamin and almost completely eradicated the tribe of Benjamin. And we'll talk about why that was here in a few minutes. Key events. There's lots of events that take place in this book, but I think the most popular, the most memorable ones are the story about Deborah and Barak and Sisera, who was the captain of the hosts of Jabin, the king of the Canaanites, and his defeat by an otherwise unknown woman named Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite, who drove a peg through his temple while he rested in her tent. She invited him in, said, "Come on in and rest," and then she gave him some milk to drink, and he went sound asleep, and she pulled out a tent peg and drove it through his head. And so just a woman who was otherwise unknown defeated the enemy for him. And that was prophesied by Deborah, that the battle would be won by a woman. So another very memorable account is the one of Gideon and his band of soldiers, who were the real 300. Have you heard about the 300? People want to talk about the Spartans, and there's a movie, The 300, but in the historical accounts, that's been really embellished. In fact, I think in the historical account, I can't remember which historian wrote about it, but it was actually about 10,000. I think it was about 10,000 Spartans in his account, and so they glamorized it and knocked it down to 300. But the original 300 was Gideon. Gideon with 300 soldiers overcome a Midianite and Amalekite army of over 135,000. Folks, that's incredible odds, but they did it with a plan that God came up with, and with God's favor. And then finally, the most famous of the judges, Samson, in his account of betrayal by his wife Delilah and her people, the Philistines. Key places. Now this is where we'll look at the map, and some of these parts that aren't as well known in the book of Judges, we'll kind of elaborate a little bit on some of these as we look at some of these key places. The first place I want to draw your attention, now there's a lot of them here. I got to remember where some of these are myself. Bochum. And you see there's a question mark right there, and that is because archaeologists aren't entirely sure that that's the location, but they think that might be the location of Bochum. The things I'm reading now are from Tyndale's Bible Maps and Charts, and they had, book by book, they have these key places, and so I didn't need to reinvent the wheel. They already had this done for me, so I'm just going to read this. The book of Judges opens with the Israelites continuing their conquest of the Promised Land. Their failure to obey God and destroy all the evil inhabitants soon comes back to haunt them in two ways. One, the enemies reorganized and counterattacked. And two, the Israelites turned away from God, adopting the evil and idolatrous practices of the inhabitants of the land. the angel of the Lord appeared at Bochim to inform the Israelites that their agreement with God would result in punishment through oppression. And so that's the believed location where this took place. Next is Jericho. Now, you may be thinking, well, Jericho was destroyed, right? Well, remember, in these cities that are mentioned in the Bible, a lot of times there was a city proper, and then there was a lot of agricultural land around those cities that was also called Jericho. And so we're not talking about the city that was destroyed. We're talking about probably the rural areas around that. The nation of Moab was one of the first to oppress Israel. Moab's king Eglon conquered much of Israel, including Jericho, and forced the people to pay unreasonable taxes. The messenger chosen to deliver this tax money to King Eglon, his name was Ehud, one of the judges. But he had more than money to deliver, for he drew his hidden sword and killed the Moabite king. Ehud then escaped, only to return with an army that chased out the Moabites and freed Israel from its oppressors. That accounts in chapter 3, 12 through 31. Next city to look at is Hazor. That's up north. Hazor, after Ehud's death, King Jabin of Hazor conquered Israel and oppressed the people for 20 years. Then Deborah became Israel's leader. She summoned Barak to fight Commander Sisera, the leader of Jabin's army. Together, Deborah and Barak led their army into battle against Jabin's forces in the land between Mount Tabor and the Kishon River and conquered them. That accounts in chapters 4 and 5. Next is the Heel of Mora. Where is the Heel of Mora? After 40 years of peace, the Midianites began to harass the Israelites again by destroying their flocks and their crops. When the Israelites finally cried out to God, He chose Gideon, a poor and humble farmer, to be their deliverer. After struggling with doubt and feelings of inferiority, Gideon took courage and knocked down his town's altar to Baal, causing a great uproar among the citizens. Filled with the Spirit of God, he attacked the vast army of Midian, which was camped near the Heel of Mora, which with just a handful, 300 men, he sent the army running away in confusion. Next, notice Shechem right here. Shechem. Even great leaders make mistakes. Gideon's relations with a concubine in Shechem resulted in the birth of a son named Abimelech. Abimelech turned out to be a treacherous and power-hungry man, stirring up the people to proclaim him king. To carry out his plan, he went so far as to kill 69 of his 70 half-brothers. Eventually, some men of Shechem rebelled against Abimelech, but he gathered together an army and defeated them. His lust for power led him to ransack 2 other cities, but he was killed by a woman again who dropped a millstone onto his head. A millstone. He probably didn't feel anything. It was quick. It would have been quick. Have you ever seen a millstone? Huge, gargantuan stone. I don't know how this woman got it out of there. She must have used some kind of fulcrum and lever and just kind of pushed it over out of the tower. I don't know. Good riddance, though. He was a terrible man. Land of Ammon. This is the land of Ammon over here. Again, Israel turned completely from God, so God turned from them. But when the Ammonites mobilized their army to attack, Israel threw away her idols and called upon God once again. Jephthah, a prostitute's son who had been running out of Israel, was asked to return and lead Israel's forces against the enemy. After defeating the Ammonites, Jephthah became involved in a war with the tribe of Ephraim over a misunderstanding. That's recorded in chapters 10 through 12, verse 15. Next location is Timnah, right here. Timnah. Israel's next judge, Sampson, was a miracle child promised by God to a barren couple. He was the one who would begin to free Israel from her next oppressor, the Philistines. According to God's command, Samson was to be a Nazirite. One who took the Nazirite vow was supposed to be set apart to God for a special service to God. One of the stipulations of that vow was that his hair could never be cut. But when Samson grew up, of course we can tell from the narrative, he didn't always keep his responsibility to God very seriously. He fell in love with a Philistine girl in Timnah and asked to marry her. Before the wedding, Samson held a party for some men of the city, using a riddle to place a bet with them. The men, however, forced Samson's fiancée into giving the answer. Furious at being tricked, Samson paid his bet with the lives of 30 Philistines who lived in a nearby city of Ashkelon. I don't know if Ashkelon is on this map, but Ashkelon is somewhere in this area right here. The Valley of Sorek, and that last account is in chapter 13 and 14. The Valley of Sorek, right there, around where the Philistines had 5 lords and 5 major cities, all in this area. Gaza was one of them. We'll talk about that in a minute. The Valley of Sorek. Samson killed thousands of Philistines with his incredible strength. The nation's leaders looked for a way to stop him, and they finally got their chance when another Philistine woman stole Samson's heart. Her name was Delilah, and she lived in the Valley of Sorek. In exchange for a great sum of money, Delilah deceived Samson into confiding in her the secret of his strength. One of the dumbest things I ever read in Scripture. I never understood why he would reveal to her the secret of his strength. But for some reason he did. And so one night while he was sleeping, Delilah had all this hair cut off, and as a result, he fell helplessly into the hands of the enemy. Chapters 15 and 16. The next chapter begins, and this city right here will be important. Gaza. Samson was blinded and led captain to a prison in Gaza. There his hair began to grow again, and after a while the Philistines, they held a great festival to celebrate Samson's imprisonment and humiliate him before the crowds. When he was brought out as entertainment, he literally brought down the house. When he pushed on the main pillars of the banquet hall, which fell and killed thousands of Philistines who were all meeting and trapped inside. And the prophecy that he would begin to free Israel from the Philistines came true. Chapter 16, verses 21 through 31. Next, the hill country of Ephraim. The hill country of Ephraim. These last chapters of the Judges, I think, get neglected. A lot people aren't normally as familiar with these last chapters. In the hill country of Ephraim lived a man named Micah. Micah, this is not the Micah that is one of the books of the minor prophets. This is a different Micah. Micah hired his own priest to perform priestly duties in the shrine which housed his collection of idols. He thought that he was pleasing God with all his religiosity. Like many of the Israelites, Micah assumed that his own opinions of what was right would agree with God's. Chapter 17, 1 through 13. That account is given as a backstory to what we read next that takes place way up here in Dan. The tribe of Dan, which if we go back and look at the tribal allotments, where's Dan? Dan is right here, all right? All right, the tribe of Dan migrated north in order to find a new territory. They sent spies out ahead of them to scout out the land. One night the spies stopped at Micah's house, the same Micah that had those idols and had hired his own priest. Looking for some assurance of victory, the spies stole Micah's idols and the priest. Rejoining the tribe, they came to the city of Laish. This city was once called Laish. They came to this city and slaughtered the unarmed and innocent citizens, renaming the conquered city Dan. Micah's idols were then set up in the city and became a focal point of the tribe's worship for many years. Chapter 18, 1 through 31. And it was many years, because you may remember the time of Kings when Jeroboam and Rehoboam, when the tribes were split. You remember what Jeroboam did? He set up calves to worship in Bethel and Dan. So this indeed was a place of idolatry for many, many years, a thorn in the side of Israel. Next, let's look at Gibeah. Gibeah, where is, there it is, Gibeah, right here. The extent to which the people had fallen away from God became clear in Gibeah, a village in the territory of Benjamin. A man and his concubine were traveling north toward the hill country of Ephraim. They stopped for the night in Gibeah, thinking they would be safe, but some perverts in the city gathered around the home where they were staying and demanded the man come out so that they could have sexual relations with him. Instead, the man and his host pushed the concubine out the door. She was raped and abused all night. When the man found her lifeless body the next morning, he cut her into 12 pieces and sent parts to each of the tribes of Israel. This tragic event demonstrated that the nation had sunk to its lowest spiritual level. Chapter 19, 1 through 30. And then real quickly, Mizpah, the leaders of Israel came to Mizpah to decide how to punish the wicked men from the city of Gibeah. When the city leaders refused to turn the criminals over, the whole nation of Israel took vengeance upon both Gibeah and the tribe of Benjamin, where the city was located. When the battle ended, the entire tribe had been destroyed except for a handful of men who took refuge in the hills. Israel had become morally depraved. The stage was now set for the much-needed spiritual renewal that would come under the prophet of Samuel. I know we are about out of time. I will use the invitation devotional time to talk about one of these lessons, but just real quickly, some of the lessons we can learn from this book. We learn about victory through faith as we begin in the first chapter, and we see that recap, and we're reminded that if Israel would have done what God told them to do, they would have been victorious. And as long as they did, as long as Joshua was on the scene and they did what God told them to do in exactly the way He told them to do it, they were victorious. God told them that 1,000 men would flee from one man. And that's exactly what we see happen in the case of when they obeyed God. We're reminded of victory through faith, but then we're also reminded of failure through compromise. They could not drive out the inhabitants of the land in some cases. Why? It wasn't because the power of God was not strong enough to drive them out. It was because of their fear. They were afraid. Judges 1:19. But they could not drive out the inhabitants of the valley because they had chariots of iron. Question, can chariots of iron stop the will of God? No. So why is it mentioned there? It wasn't that it stopped the will of God. It became a source of fear for them. They were afraid of the chariots of iron. And their fear then became a hindrance and prevented them from doing. They had actually faced battles with chariots of iron previously. In Joshua's day, Joshua 11, 6 and 9, they were facing an army and God told them how to deal with it. He told them to hock the horses, which means cut the hamstring tendons. Horses aren't any good if you cut the hamstring. They're hamstrings. And so they were to cut the hamstrings of the horses and they were to burn the chariots. They did so and they defeated a huge army. They could have done the very same thing, but instead they let their fear of these chariots of iron prevent them from doing God's will. Are there ever chariots of iron that stand in the way of us and stand in our way today? Certainly they are. When it comes to evangelism, of course, God has told us to go forth and teach others. We've been sitting in the pews listening on how to do it for years and years, and we live in a time when it's probably one of the most biblically illiterate times in all the world, and still we don't have enough confidence to do it. We're still afraid. The world this is one of the most biblically illiterate times in the history of the world. We've been training all our lives, and we still are afraid to do it. They might as well be chariots of iron standing in the way, right? Of course, now the coronavirus is another chariot of iron. But that's another story. That'd make a good lesson. Okay, we'll stop right there. I got most of my lessons in, very abbreviated version of them. We'll look at another one when we come back. Just a few minutes.